All right, we have some breaking news to tell you about right now on Red and Blue. President Trump has just tweeted regarding his Defense Secretary, Jim Mattis, and we will read this to you just as it's coming across. General Jim Mattis will be retiring with distinction at the end of February after having served my administration as Secretary of Defense for the past 2 years. President Trump goes on to say, during Jim's tenure, tremendous progress has been made, especially with respect to the purchase of new fighting equipment. He writes, General Mattis was a great help to me in getting allies and other countries to pay their share of military obligations. A new Secretary of Defense will be named shortly. I greatly thank Jim for his service. That again from President Trump just minutes ago, announcing that his Defense Secretary, General Jim Mattis, will in fact be leaving the administration. Let's bring into this conversation CBSN contributor Gabe Lipton is here. He writes for Signal, a newsletter produced by G0 Media. And Gabe, you and I are going to talk about Syria, but let's talk about this news because it's coming on the heels of President Trump's announcement that in fact he's going to be pulling U.S. troops from Syria. The timing would certainly suggest perhaps a connection. We don't know right now. It's very important to say we're not sure exactly what the circumstances are surrounding General Mattis's departure. Nevertheless, what is your initial takeaway as you read, the president's words there, as you look at the greater context here of this decision to withdraw troops from Syria that, in fact, we know Secretary Mattis did not support? What is your initial sense of it?
Yeah, I think the fact that this is coming in a week where the U.S. announced the withdrawal of Syrian troops, there's also been news about similar withdrawal intended in Afghanistan, is important. There's a big connection there. I think the tenor of the Trump president's tweet was telling. He's retiring. He served the country well. That's a different tone than we've seen him take with other retirees or people who were dismissed from the administration. So it suggests to me that there may not be sort of a big fight brewing over some of these policies, but we know that Mattis was not happy about the withdrawal of troops from Syria. There are other issues where he's clashed with the president, particularly on Iran. But, this is a defense secretary who's now served a long time. He has served his term, and I think that it's not completely out of the question that he is retiring in sort of the regular speed that we'd expect from secretaries like this.
Given the developments, though, like the Syria announcement, for instance, it would seem to suggest some kind of connection with respect to that particular policy, or is that perhaps maybe reading too much into it at this time?
I mean, as you mentioned, we don't know yet. But Mattis is clearly someone who wanted continued support for U.S. troops in Syria. But he's had, he and the president have clashed over these things. There's a fundamental sort of divide in the administration, and the Syria withdrawal speaks to this, over sort of people like Mattis and Pompeo who want continued U.S. military commitments in the Middle East, and the president, who campaigned on the very promise to withdraw U.S. forces, right? This was a key sort of component of what won him the election, right? And I think that his decision to follow up on that pledge, to actually follow through on it, will, would be expected to cause sparks with the defense establishment.
So let's talk more about this withdrawal. So Russian President Putin is welcoming this decision. And I wonder if you can help us understand here. It is a complicated geopolitical landscape, to say the least, when you talk about Syria. But there are approximately 2,000 American troops on the ground in Syria right now, from what I understand. And Russia and the United States have held to this agreement that they would not engage in sort of direct combat or conflict kind of operations there on the ground in Syria. But I wonder if you could just explain to us, what does Russia have to gain now that the United States is pulling out of Syria?
Yeah, it's an immensely complicated war involving many internal factions and both the U.S. and Russia external powers. Russia has welcomed this decision from the U.S. president. It sees it as part of its endgame in the country. To be fair, 2,000 troops was not a serious commitment. The reality on the ground in Syria was that the Assad regime was going to take back control of the country. So this doesn't change the endgame, the calculus here. But Russia sees it as sort of an important step towards a solution, a peaceful solution, and one that it has cements what it really wants, which is the Assad regime to have complete control of the country. The Russian involvement in Syria was its first external military commitment since the collapse of since the end of the Cold War, outside of its former Soviet Union. It's a big military commitment for the country, and what it sees and what it's trying to achieve in propping up Assad is to say that around the world, we will not allow strong men to be taken down through popular revolt, and that reflects a fear within Russia of a similar thing occurring within its own borders. So Russia's very happy about this, but it enters, what we see is also a more delicate moment in the country, because you're going to start to see much more violent clashes between these different militias and militaries, and even more deaths of Russian troops there.
So I'm being told now, what was that? We have an excerpt now from the resignation letter of Defense Secretary Mattis, and it reads in part, quote, "Because you have the right to have a Secretary of Defense whose views are better aligned with yours on these and other subjects, I believe it is right for me to step down from my position." Again, that's just coming into us as we've been having our conversation here, Gabe, forgive me. But, you know, as you were talking about the situation in Syria and that very complex sort of landscape there, you do have, it's interesting, the Defense Secretary himself sort of referencing these differences that were, in fact, well known between him and the president on issues like Syria.
I think the fact that this was, now we know, and we have this breaking news, that it was indeed a resignation and not just a sort of retirement, as the president's tweet hinted, is incredibly important, because it suggests this broader division between the defense establishment and President Trump. Now, that's politically significant, of course, because President Trump has found a key base within the military establishment. He has appointed many military members to his cabinet. He's had support politically among the military within the U.S., former soldiers, families of soldiers, et cetera. So this is a very controversial decision, and the fact that Mattis stepped down, I think, will play out in political terms, domestic political terms, that are also very important.
So I just want to give our viewers a bit more context here as I'm pouring through my email and trying to multitask. So that quote, so people are aware, our David Martin, our longtime national security correspondent, is at the Pentagon, apparently has a hard copy of the letter and is giving us, as best he can, sort of excerpts of it. And that's the excerpt, the latest one that we have right now. But clearly, as you've pointed out, Gabe, significant, because we know now at least the context of the Defense Secretary's own thinking here, that it has this appearance of at least not something that was necessarily a natural kind of process.